start the meeting. We're not running things, but thanks to Janine, I think we may be able to get through it. And so any mistakes, I apologize in advance if I goof up here, but I've got to sort of go this way first to introduce myself. I'm Jean-Daniel Nolan. I'm the chair of the Hell's Kitchen Clinton Land Use and Zoning Committee of Manhattan Community Board 4. And we have one item on the agenda tonight. And as per the Governor's Executive Order 2002-1, we are running this meeting remotely, and it's being recorded and transcribed. So keep that, be mindful of what you say, it's being recorded. And a recording will be posted on our YouTube page. Whoa. So please stay muted unless you're going to speak, so we don't have aggravating sounds in the background. We're going to have a presentation, and then we'll take questions. And the public is welcome also to ask questions or make comments. We'll do our best to keep the order which you raise your hand, but sometimes we may get out of order because there's no way to really know. So I apologize if I don't call it on you in the order that you raised your hand, but Janine will try to do that. Before we start, I think I'd like to go around and introduce ourselves one by one. And even before that, I want to welcome two new members that we have on the committee. And the first member is Paul Devlin. I think it's a French name.
Jean-Daniel, merci.
Ah, de rien. Now, there you are. So welcome, Paul. This is a great honor to have you join us. Paul is a board member, and he is the co-chair of the Chelsea Land Use Committee. And it's traditional to have somebody from Chelsea on our committee because they need to learn how a real land use committee works. So welcome, Paul. It's really a pleasure to have you with us.
What a sweet introduction. Thank you, JD. I look forward to learning so much.
I'm sure you can teach us too, Paul. And the second member, Raksha, are you there? We have a new board member and she's joined the committee.
I'm here.
Are you here? I can't see you. Where are you?
That's a good question, but I'm right here. Yeah.
Oh, there you are. There you are. Raksha, first of all, forgive me for mispronouncing your name and your last name. Help me out here.
It's Raksha Muthukumar. You actually did great.
Okay. We want to welcome you to the committee. This is just great. Can you, we didn't get to meet you at the board meeting when we had a little introduction. You're living on 34th Street, is that right?
Yeah, I'm at 34th and 9th. And this is my first time on the board. So it was my first time at a committee meeting as a board member. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning a lot as well.
Well, we're looking forward to having you on the committee. This is just great. Welcome to you. And I don't know, how can we start, Janine? Just go around and say hello. We haven't seen each other for a while.
Yeah, you can go around. Everyone can introduce themselves. And then
okay, who starts? I'm JD, and then it's Janine, and then we have this guy, Bob.
Yeah, Bob Benfado, public member.
And
nothing else to
Paul,
say. Welcome, Paul and Raksha.
Frank Halzubier,
Okay,
member.
Hey, Frank. Is Brian with us?
Brian Weber, public member. How's everyone doing?
Skip
Okay,
Williams.
welcome, Brian.
Les Williams.
And Brian Sokol. Hey,
Another
there's
Brian.
Leslie. Hey,
Brian Sokol.
okay, come. And Morgan, you're with Sarah Mills, you're with us.
Hi, JD. Hi,
Hey,
guys.
Sarah. Good to see you. Morgan,
How you doing, everybody?
good. And David, thank goodness you're here.
Yes, hello. Hi, everybody.
Hi,
Board member.
Hey, and James.
Hi, James Wallace, board member.
Hey, and last but not least, Dale. Hey, Dale.
Hi, JD. I made it. How are you?
Yay.
You
And
have
Chris.
two looking good, Dale. There you go.
Chris, are you with us?
Very much so. How's it going, guys?
Hey, welcome, welcome, Chris. And Dolores.
Dolores is here.
Hi, Dolores. Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you all again. Tonight, I'm going to turn this over to David Solnick because he came up with this very important idea of looking into sanitation, trash pickup from big buildings on our streets. As you know, sometimes you can't walk on the sidewalk. You got to walk out in the street to get around these big garbage bags. So through the fund of the City of New York, we were able to engage a planning fellow, Shruti Punjabi, who has looked into this problem and is going to present tonight her findings. Hello, Shruti, welcome. And Shruti is in India right now, I believe.
Oh, no, I'm in New York. I'm still here.
Oh, you're still here. Okay.
Yeah.
So Shruti, welcome. I'm going to turn this over to David. David, it's all yours.
Well, I think your introduction was pretty complete. Yeah, the project started with the realization that New York City really has no regulations regarding how trash is dealt with in new development, new residential development specifically, and which was quite astounding to me because, you know, everywhere I've worked, that's waste management plans were part of any submittals for new development. And, you know, I received a very welcome ear when discussing this with various people. And as JD said, so welcome that we were able to have a planning fellow from NYU to work on it, who's just graduated, I believe, that's Shruti. And so she's worked long and hard on it and put together quite a package. And, you know, hopefully some of you have had a chance to look at it, but even if not, I think she'll as usual, do a pretty thorough job of taking us through it. So Shruti, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, David. So for the past year, I've been under the guidance of David and Jesse. I've been working to understand the solid waste management system within our community board and see what are the shortfalls that causes problems that JD mentioned about the obstruction on sidewalks and the road ends and the unhygienic conditions for the pedestrians and so on. I would want, Janine, if you can pull the presentation, it would be helpful.
All right, just let me know whenever you want me to switch the screens.
We can go to the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, just to run through the timeline that we followed, it was to just try and understand what kind of demography do we have right now inside our board, and what is the building typology, how is the density increasing, what is the current state of the solid waste management system within our community board, and then to discuss with both government officials, including members of DSNY, as well as some of the building staff of buildings who have been called upon as best practices, who have been doing really good with managing their waste, and not just that, but also trying to understand how this entire management works in the private domain versus when it comes out in the public domain on the streets. Following that, we talked to a lot of people, and we did a lot of review based on what we have in New York, and then especially in Community Board 4, and then to understand what are other cities and neighborhoods with similar scale and size and development pace are doing to address their challenges when it comes to solid waste management. And then based on all that, we tried to see what can we do best to address the problems that we have currently inside our board. Next, please. Yeah, so as JD mentioned, this is a common sight right now inside the community board where we see that there's a lot of obstructions. It's very hard for pedestrians to move smoothly on the sidewalks. There's a lot of hygiene issues because the bags litter, they open, there are rodents around. So the idea is to basically try and understand how we can stop this and how can we just get rid of these bags completely and make our sidewalks free for pedestrians to move smoothly, and also to ensure that on a larger scale, to ensure that how buildings can more efficiently manage the waste, which is just currently thrown out on the streets before the DSNY trucks pick it up. Next, please. The central idea here was to focus on high-rise residential developments, the new ones and the ones that are getting redeveloped. The idea was to target buildings which are 20 plus floors or like 300 plus units, because those are the buildings that create chaos on the sidewalks. Because if we have, let's say, 800 households living in a building and all the waste coming out 3 times a week or 2 times a week on the street from all these households, it's very hard to really manage that waste on a small sidewalk. Which does not really have that capacity to take care of all such big, large chunks of garbage bags piled on it. Next, please. So just to do a background, just to get a background understanding of how our community board is developing, we've observed that from 2000 to 2010, there was an increase of almost 34% per hectare in our neighborhood. That means we know that the residential density is increasing, and we need to account for all these new people who are now becoming a part of our neighborhood and would definitely need a lot better and lot well balanced and managed infrastructure facilities. So with this increase in residential population, we really need to think about our infrastructure facilities, and for this particular project we are focusing on the solid waste management. Next, please. So in the beginning, we tried to understand what are the different kind of interventions that we can pursue in order to take care of the current situation. And what we found out was that we have a set of in-building interventions, which is basically things that we can do within the building unit in order to manage our waste. This includes how we store our waste, where do we store it, what is the design of the place where the waste is stored, how accessible is that place to the DSNY trucks. While there are some interventions which can be done on street, where right now we see a pile of garbage bags, where the city agencies who own different parts of the street really need to come in picture and say that we need to better understand how we can store the waste that comes out from each of these buildings on the streets. So the main idea here is to not look at these in isolation, but rather understand how these in-building interventions are connected and work in harmony with the on-street interventions. Next, please. Yeah, so just to give a little bit idea about what are the different features of these interventions. When we talk about something that we can do to better manage our waste within the building, we talk about what are the size of the bins, how is the waste storage, where is it storage, what are the diversion program requirements, how is the waste collected, how is it moved out on the street, where is the loading area, what is the design style of it, is it accessible to DSNY or is it not? If not, what can we do in that regard? And then there are some features of the on-street interventions which are more design element based, where we need to understand how can we move towards a more containerized system rather than just having these bags on the sidewalks? And then what could be the storage capacity of these containers? Where could they be stored? Should it be on the sidewalk? Should it be on the road, on the street? Where should it be exactly? So that's some of the features. Next, please. To to understand what other cities are doing to address similar situations where the residential densities are moving up really fast, we looked through some of the case studies, and we tried to understand the different types of in-building and on-street interventions that are taken up, some of the most innovative, creative, smart, really detail-oriented interventions taken up by some of these cities. And as we move along, we'll find out more about each of them. Next, please. Just to start with the in-building interventions, we tried to look at the building code of these different, that these different cities and standards follow, and try to understand how and what kind of details do they provide, or do they mandate developers to follow in order to get like an approval, or during the inspections, what are the things that the Department of Buildings take care of or look into for giving an approval to the developer. So we looked at Toronto, some of the British standards, and then Seattle, and we found that all the three had something in common, that they had these really strict, extremely detailed guidelines about how the waste should be stored within the building, and that was really interesting to look at. We can go through some of them right now. Next, please. So some of these guidelines talked about the diversion options that are available for developers. This includes whether, based on the size of the building, do we need a chute? Do we need to have some other kind of facility? Do we need like 5 chutes? How and where do these chutes be located? What is the, for what size of building, what size of space should be provided for each of the chutes, and all those certain level of details that the building developers need to keep in mind way before they start planning and developing the residential building. Next, please. One of the most interesting aspects that I found was the storage bin requirements, which we usually feel any developer would probably figure out on its own, or like would have an idea to plan for based on the number of households that they have. Toronto had very specific guidelines on what should be the size of the containers based on the number of people that would be accommodated in their residential development, just on average household size, number of units that they have. The British standards clearly showed that they had like a equation to find out that every residential development needs to follow, where they need to understand that if they have this capacity, this many people who will be residing in that particular development, they need to predict the amount of waste that comes out from their building, and they need to plan the storage space and rest of the solid waste management and disposal facilities according to that. Similarly, Seattle had very specific requirements based on the number of units. As the units increase, the size should be altered rather than having like a standard given to developers and then letting the developers decide what they want to do with the space, the space needed for this particular public utility. Next, please. They also had very specific requirements mentioned about the waste storage room, where it should be located, what size should it be, based, and all of these guidelines were in retrospect with the size, the number of units, the location of the building. Everything mattered when all of these things were designed as a guideline for residential developments in these different standards and cities. Next, please. Another in-building requirement that was observed and was probably mentioned in a lot of detail was the loading area requirements. In New York, we have the zoning resolution, which basically supports or explains or mandates the type and the location and the size and the design of the loading area. And here we saw that for Toronto and Seattle, they had details about the width, the grade, the length, each and everything in order to account for both public and private utilities to move in and out of the building, and not just restricting the use to just the private, the owners and to make sure that there's a communication between the private utility and the public and the private building and the public utility, and they're working in harmony. Next, please. So after looking at some of the in-building requirements, which explained some of the details about how and where these the waste storage should be managed, we also looked at some of the on-street interventions, and we found that there are very interesting ways in which the waste is stored on the street rather than having a pile of bags, to manage the waste well, to make sure that it's both accessible to the building staff smoothly as well as to the DSNY. In that case, their particular city agency staff access was also kept in mind. The pictures talk themselves about how these are placed. And yeah, I think next, please. Yes, these are also some of the other examples that we found where there was an attempt to make these on-street interventions more interactive, more people-friendly, and easily accessible. Next, please. Yes. So after looking at everything that other cities are doing, I tried to dive a little deep and understand what exactly is happening when it comes to our building code and our DSNY rules, and what do we have right now, and why is this problem existing, and what level of intervention, what level of mandates are existing in our standards and rules. So what I found out was that we do have some set of mandates for developers, but they are very open-ended and loose as of now. There's no clear demarcation or explanation about how the waste storage should be designed. More than that, what should be the size of the waste storage, which is a very basic requirement. If we look at the middle column, and if we just look at that point where they talk about buildings currently they have 1 to 8 cubic yard only picked up from the buildings, and they also have this rule where they mention that if the size of the building is beyond a certain limit, the building developers need to have a standard amount of storage space. They are not mandated to have anything more than that. They can have anything less than that, and that standard that they've specified is even below bare minimum. So it's a big challenge right now to push developers to actually have efficient, optimal amount of storage space that could account for the number of residents that are actually living in that building. And then this is where the whole problem comes, where developers are given that freedom to decide what would be the profit mending square footage versus the square footage that goes to the public utility. So the problem comes in picture because we do not have that level of detail or mandate specifying or ensuring that we would plan for the amount of people who would live in that particular building, rather than just have like a standard number which is not even sufficing the bare minimum. Next, please. Based on everything that I went through, there are a set of DSNY rules and regulations. There's a set of requirements in the building code. There's some requirements in the zoning resolution. I tried to identify some of the important stakeholders who would probably be an important part in moving forward and understanding what can we basically do to address this problem. And Department of Buildings, City Planning, Fire Department because of safety, Sanitation Department, and Board of Standards and Appeal seem to be the most important stakeholders as of now. Next, please. I also tried to look at, because the type of intervention that we aim for asks for us to have this relationship between what's happening within the building and then when the waste moves out and what happens on the street. I tried to look at the control and ownership of different parts of the street in NYC and which agencies own what part and how these agencies need to collaborate with each other to bring out a solution which works cohesively. So this is just basically explaining the different owners on the street section in New York, on a typical New York street. Next, please. So based on what we discussed so far, I tried to design interventions and think of some recommendations that could help us solve this problem. The first recommendation is basically in a case where we do not, which is probably, we can call it as a short-term solution, where in buildings where it is possible that we have access that could be granted to the DSNY trucks for pickup from the private buildings, is something that we can do in the short run, although we know that based on our discussions, we've faced some issues with this intervention where there's some resistance of allowing DSNY trucks within private buildings. And the second recommendation is basically a long-term strategy that we need to follow in order to permanently get rid of this problem and get rid of all those waste that is piled up on the streets. We will be discussing both the recommendations in detail now. Next, please. Just for the short-term solution, when we went out and talked to some of the building staff of some of the buildings, and we found out that a major issue that building staff has with letting DSNY trucks use their loading deck is of safety, where they are scared that DSNY staff would not be careful of how to use that space and they might break something. And this is probably the space that they usually use to do a lot of important activities for that particular building. The loading area, the deck is very important. So they wanted some kind of agreement or some kind of insurance to be signed by DSNY, stating that if any problem happens, DSNY would take responsibility and help in solving this problem. And on the other hand, there are a lot of advantages if we allow DSNY trucks to actually enter the loading area and access the waste. First is that we would not really have anything to be piled up on the streets. The waste would directly move from the building to the truck, so there would be clear streets. We would not need to reserve any space on the right of way, which is our where the vehicles move right now, and that would be free. Then we would also have reduced traffic load because trucks would directly go inside the building and get access to the waste and then carry it outside, rather than stopping every few minutes on the right of way and blocking traffic. No rodents. It would also save time for the building staff, who right now are bringing out garbage on the street 3 times a week. But the drawbacks also exist, and one of them, as we just discussed, is the staff not being okay, and the staff feeling that handling garbage bags is much more easier than wheeled containers, and they had some kind of resistance with towards change, and they didn't want to really move to a new system. Of course, there is some level of time investment and skill building when it comes to allowing DSNY to enter private building premises. And there was a sense of resistance with the building staff also to let DSNY pickup trucks to enter. So there are both pros and cons, and although this could be a short-term solution, and we can all talk and discuss about this more. We can now talk about the long-term solution. Next, please. So when I say this to be a long-term solution, it's only because there are multiple parts to it, but for it to actually come in action, we really need to take certain steps right now to start the process. So one of the important parts of this recommendation is waste quantification, which is not happening right now at all because it's not mandated under any of the rules that we discussed. And the developers are basically using their discretion to decide what amount of space should be dedicated to for solid waste storage within their building. So it's very important. The map basically gives us an idea about what's currently happening and what is the pressure on our current sidewalks based on the amount of trash that comes out on those sidewalks. So if you see like the maroonish dark brown block, that's somewhere right before West 42nd Street. So that particular block, the sidewalk in surrounding that particular block almost carries 3.8 pounds of waste per linear foot of sidewalk, which is a lot. And this happens as a process for like a lot of hours before the DSNY trucks pick them up. In between those hours, we have to take care of the weather. There's snow, there's rains, there's rodents, there's everything happening all together, and it's a complete chaos. So we definitely need to find out a way to ensure that the waste is supposed to be quantified in terms of like doing a prediction based on the average household size in particular residential building based on the number of units that they have. Next, please. We also need to, as a second part of this recommendation, we also need to mandate a strategic plan for waste management for every residential building, where we need to ensure that with every new building coming up right now, or any redevelopment that is taking place, there is a plan that ties up what's happening within the building when the waste comes out, when is it picked up by DSNY, into a complete route, so that there's no chaos there. We also need to ensure and allow for in-building garbage storage space and how it is constructed, what size it is, and its design. Having a route, having something in building, and then having something on street. These three things are very important, because once we have a concrete plan of how will we manage our waste on the street, and then how will we manage our waste in the building, we need to tie it up in a route so that the entire system works cohesively. Next, please. This graphic just basically explains how we can move towards a containerized waste collection system. And it is something that is very much doable within our community board, wherein we have the bags, they get compacted, they get stored in wheeled containers, transferred to the right of way, where we have a designated space, not on the sidewalk, but on the right of way, to store all these different types of waste, which then gets picked up by the trucks and then goes to the transfer station. So this is just like a visual which explains it's possible. To discuss some of the amendments that we can do in order to allow Department of Buildings, Department of Sanitation to allow them to ensure that the building developers are making sure that they're providing enough space for waste storage, is first we need to specify clear instructions for the location, design, size, material, and the safety of waste storage receptacles within the high-rise residential buildings. And this needs to happen as an amendment within the building code, where we have this section which explains and details out each and every guideline of what should be this based on your building unit and the number of building units, households you plan to have within your building, what should be the size of the waste storage room. Second, we need to mandate containerization in high-rise multi-unit residential buildings. When I say high-rise multi-unit, just to reflect back, it means a building which is 300 plus units. And also we already have these zero waste guidelines, which has done a lot of work on specifying the dimensions of the waste bins that could be used within residential buildings for storing waste. So we can use that resource to basically reinforce our work and understand what size of waste containers that would be needed in different types of buildings based on its size and capacity. Next, please. We discussed this before, but again, as an amendment, we need to mandate waste quantification and construction of responsive waste management system in high-rise buildings. We know that we don't have that right now, which leads to a lot of ambiguity and openness for the developers to decide for themselves what they want to do and how they want to do and how much space they want to give for like 900 residents. So we need to account for that. Next, please. We also need to mandate design guidelines for the construction, access, and safety of the loading area, because we're talking about new developments and redevelopments. This is something that we can control, and this is something where we can try and ensure that we don't really allow the waste to come out, and we let there should be some kind of agreement between DSNY and the private building to work in harmony and let the DSNY pickup trucks enter inside. If not, then at least have that sort of a system where the loading deck is located in a way that the waste can smoothly come out with less effort to be made by the building staff and less efforts to be made by the DSNY pickup trucks to easily then access the waste, which would be located in containers on the right of way for pickup. This is just a summary of a lot of different things that we just discussed. Although I do believe that some of these things would need a step-by-step procedure. But for now, next please, we do have something that we need to start working on, and that's the call for action, where we need to understand that the different things that we discussed needs to be properly framed and needs to be added as or amended in the building code to ensure that the new buildings are from the beginning ensuring if proper optimal waste storage within new developments. So the starting point would be to draft these new amendments, which would have all sorts of details for to be entered within the building code and need to be followed by the building developers overall, which would allow us to handle the in-building side of the waste storage and waste management and disposal system. And the second thing is that with everything that we discussed, there are a lot of elements that need to be accounted for by the building developers. And one of the interesting things that I found I think in Seattle was that they had this solid waste storage and access checklist that needs to be completed by every building developer and needs to be submitted to their respective department, in our case, Department of Buildings, to get an approval to move ahead. And I think it's very important to understand the elements of this checklist and actually draft one for our buildings and to ensure that this becomes a part of our system, and whatever new amendments that we've made in the building code are actually followed and inspected and are in place way before the building's actually functioning completely. That's about it.
Thank you, Shruti. David. David,
yes. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is, it's a lot of material, and it's a lot of good material and a lot of things that need to be taken very seriously. A thought I had as Shruti was presenting this, I mean, of course, the question is, how do we give this legs? That's ultimately the question. And, there are longer term solutions to actually drafting what Shruti's talking about, drafting these new regulations for new developments. That will take time and expertise, and it obviously has to be specific to New York City and possibly specific to regions of New York City. Mm-hmm. Well, not possibly, certainly it has to be specific to parts of New York City. So that's probably not a excuse me, that's probably not a short-term That's probably not something that's going to happen quickly, but something that we could. I mean, we need to get that ball rolling, and I'm not even sure the best way to do it. But a ball that we could actually roll ourselves is to require developers when they come to us to have a waste management plan in the same way that we require developers to intersperse their affordable units throughout the building, even though I don't think that was required, by code, but that's what we wanted, and that's what we said. We're not going to approve your project unless we see that, and so on. That's been very common. I think we could do the same thing with this issue, where we say, okay, we know you don't really have any good guidelines, and they're being worked on. But in the meantime, we need to see your waste management plan, and that'll be part of what we review when we review your project. And to just sort of put them on notice from the beginning, as we wait for this more formal process of very precise development guidelines.
David, that's excellent. I want to, before we continue, I want to welcome Carl Wilson. I believe you're watching from the Speaker's office. Welcome, Carl. And Lizette Chaparro from the VP's office. I believe you have joined us. So welcome to both of you. Shruti, what a terrific and thorough research into this topic. I think David has an excellent idea about what we can do on the committee, and maybe some other things we can generate. So thank you for that wonderful and thorough report. We have some questions. I know James Wallace, you had some questions, and Janine, are you paying it? I can't see who's raising their hand. I can't get a full screen of everybody. So James, are you there?
Yes. Hi.
Hey.
First, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Shruti, I want to thank you because that was an amazing presentation. You obviously did a lot of work, and we really appreciate it. And this is an issue that I think most New Yorkers just walking around the streets go, what is going on? Like, why can't we fix this? So thank you for addressing it. I guess my first question, maybe this is for Bob or Janine, is what's the nature? I know that we have fellows that do this kind of research. What's the nature of the scope? And is this, is Shruti done with this project? Or is there, if we wanted more, would we have to, start another fellowship, or would Shruti be able to follow up? I'm just wondering, before I have any questions, is this completed and done, or is there an opportunity for Shruti to do more work? And then I have another question.
Bob, maybe you can answer that question. Shruti's a student at NYU, and the fund for the city
is for one semester, and that's it.
Got it.
To hire Shruti for her to continue to do it, and she's smiling, so I don't think she'd be opposed to that idea. Or you'd have to give it to continuation to the next fellow that Jesse gets out of the program.
Yeah. Got
it. Well, in light of that, please don't take any of this as a criticism per se, but I think it's evident that to I think anyone who lives in this area, it's self-evident that there needs to be improvement. But I think most people on the board would acknowledge and agree that anything in this city can't be done without some sort of economic justification. And although you do address, for example, the complexities of dealing with DSNY, and I think that's a whole nother ball of wax that you could spend a whole nother presentation discussing. And although I support unions, I mean, clearly, the union would have potentially some pushback with regard to retraining and using some of the more automated methods. The other thing that I think could bear some additional investigation would be the costs and benefits. Obviously, we all want less trash on the sidewalk, but I think the question becomes, and just to really lay out the needs assessment, and maybe Shruti, if you came across any of this kind of calculation, you could enlighten us. But things like economic impact of, the health impacts, economic impact of the inefficiency, and what the benefits would be and the costs of implementing some of these solutions, both to the city and to the agencies that would be having to implement some of these solutions, and of course the developers.
Just to talk about that for the first part, me and David, we have been having this constant discussion about the resistance, but the good part is that on March 11th, I guess, 2020, I think the commissioner of the Department of Sanitation actually released this information, and I think it was a New York Times article where they talk about similar interventions that they're planning for. We also had a meeting with a member from Department of Sanitation who did not give us a lot of details, but did mention that there is something similar that has been in conversation and that has been in discussions at Department of Sanitation. And it was a twofold intervention that that article mentioned, where they talked about, first of all, containerization, and second of all, ensuring waste storage. It's very similar. It came, we started working on this in September 2019, and the article came May 2020. And it basically detailed, it didn't give us a lot of information. And I think after that, due to COVID-19 and all the uncertainty that came along with it, I am guessing that the plan is probably pushed back a little, but it mentioned having these two plans. It didn't really talk about how would they work cohesively, but Department of Sanitation did talk about finding out ways to ensure waste storage within the building, as well as containerization of waste on the street. So this is something that they're continuously discussing, I guess, and it is in their heads too. And about the economic impact, I feel that based on my discussion with David, where there were certain proposals submitted about how would waste be stored on street, taking away certain parking spaces, which are very precious and very close to every resident's heart, because parking is also another challenge in the city. And it seemed that Department of Transportation is, I think David can also talk more about this, but it seems that they are okay with letting us have few of the parking spaces off the street to be converted into these waste storage receptacles that would be locked and enclosed and would have this GPS system, which would let us understand how these containers are moved when the DSNY trucks come. And so these are some of the discussions that were parallelly happening when we were trying to draft some of the proposals. So I feel this is not something that is coming out from our board. We do have something which is much more concrete and much more cohesive, but there are discussions that are already happening of thinking of these things in isolation within city agencies.
Thank you, Trudy. Good question, James.
One of you guys, great work, and thank you.
Thank you, James. Janine,
one thing to that very good question about the economic.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
I mean, I think it's a good point, but I think the what we found out, in touring buildings, is that the developers, in some cases, at least, the big projects that we saw, the developers are interested in this as well. Not that they want to take space out of their building, of course, but what they do want is to not have their brand new buildings, right? The front of their brand new buildings stuffed with trash. So, you don't underestimate the economic value of that to the developer themselves. What they've been lacking is rules. And as we all know, developers need guidelines. They need rules to know what to follow. And yeah, they like to push them back and, et cetera, but there haven't been any. So it's been kind of, cowboy land. But I think that's the economic incentive, is to beautify the front of these brand new luxury residential buildings. That's what's going to happen.
Good point. Janine, has anybody else raised their hand?
Yeah, so Dale and then Leslie.
Dale, go ahead. Glad you're still with us.
Yeah, the connection's really unstable out here, but
yeah.
So Shri, thank you for the excellent presentation. You made a lot of stuff that's hard to grasp, comprehensible. And, this definitely does have transportation impacts. So I would like to see it summarized or presented or summarized at the next transportation planning meeting. I have questions for, first of all, Janine, do we have this PDF?
Yes, I have it. I can send it to you.
Okay, perfect. I guess my or seek to attain LEED certification in the different levels. Are there any waste management components to LEED certifications?
That's a great question. I haven't checked the LEED certification mandates. Although I feel that some of these interventions that we've been discussing about are very context specific, and then I do feel that having the way we define a high-rise residential building is very different from how some other cities within United States does. And then because of all these differentiations in definitions itself, it gets complicated to have these level of details within the LEED mandates. I believe so, but I would definitely check it and make sure that.
And I appreciate the complexity of trying to to generalize, but it seems like if the building is going to look towards a goal of sustainable construction and sustainable environmental, like the waste management system would be part and parcel of that.
Mm-hmm.
I also, you guys know that we have seen so many buildings that have basically outsourced their program space and their function space to the sidewalk, whether it's laundry service, whether it's delivery, whether it's using putatively designated freight loading docks for anything but, they just wind up using it for other building services. I would love to see something in the code that is like a tiered, set of requirements for waste management capacity inside the building. I recognize that that is a long way off, but I almost feel like if there was like almost something comparable to LEED, where it's like, do you want a gold star? Then you need to do this. Do you need a silver star? Then you need to do this. Like, if there was like, if we could implement some standards and say, this is what the goal should be, regardless of what's in the code, and this would certify you as a gold star waste management, neighbor or what have you.
Yeah, good point, Dale. Good point. Leslie, Les Williams, you got it?
Yes, I'm on.
Hey,
Shruti, a great presentation. It was fantastic, very thorough. I just had a question about your observations from your profiles of other places, probably including New York, in terms of security aspect of it for these devices on streets when it comes to terrorism, etc. Can you give us any idea of what other places may be looking at?
That is one of the discussions that's going on when it comes to allowing anyone who's not a part of the building or authorized to enter the building to allow them to enter the building, be it even if it's just a public agency truck. And based on my discussions with a lot of building staff, they had a lot of resistance in doing that. One of the reasons was safety, for sure, not just of accessing a particular space, which is the loading dock, which is very dear to them, but also of the residents of the building, and to ensure that, because this is going to be like happening twice or thrice a week, how would it be monitored? These are some of the discussions which have been happening when it is about allowing DSNY trucks to enter the unit. Although when it is about storing the waste on the street, there have been concerns that because now they will be enclosed and they might be accessible to rack pickers or people who just homeless people who are trying to like open the recycle bags and like trying to sort waste and to earn some money. The idea was here to, and also I think it was picked up from one of David's proposals with something that he had worked on, where there was a system to monitor and keep the waste containers locked so that they do not become a place of where any kind of mischief can take place, or anything unsafe, or anything, any wrong, malign things can take place. So the idea was to secure it with locks, have a GPS system, and I do agree with you that when it comes to in-building access to anyone except the ones who are authorized by the building, be it even DSNY, there are concerns. But this is what we have so far in terms of safety.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Les. Janine, is anybody calling in from the public?
Sorry, I see no one with their hands raised.
Okay. Again, Shruti, that was just terrific. And David, good for you for pushing this sort of thing. I'm not quite sure what our next step is, but I think to follow up what Dale was saying, I think we could draft some language, at least for the Land Use Committee, to bring up to developers that come to the meeting to request a zoning change. And we can say, what are you doing about that? We've done it on some other issues. I think that's one way we can start pushing this. There may be other ways. David, do you, let me ask Shruti that there is no formula for estimating the space in a new building that would be required to contain the trash. Is that right?
There is a formula, although it's right now specific to the country, to the city where I studied it from, but we can customize it and make it more specific to our community board, because we do have all the statistics about what is the average. When the developer comes to us, I'm sure they have an idea about how many floors they're going to have, what are the amount of building units that they have, and based on average household size, it's very much doable that we can have a waste quantification formula, which should be a part of the solid waste management plan that David was talking about, or the checklist that I was talking about, which needs to be filled out, and all the points should be checked in. One of them could be the waste quantification.
That's excellent. We could also develop that checklist for the committee. If a developer comes, is that right, Shruti? We could have our own checklist? Okay.
For sure, yeah.
Those are some things we can do on the committee. Any other thoughts about what our next step would be? David?
Well, I presume we're going to send a letter to DSNY and I mean, I don't know whether we're doing this with DOT, with transportation or not. As Dale said, it'd be good to have, the transportation does have that one component which involves the, parking spots. But either way, I mean, I assume the plan is to lay out our, at least a generalized proposal about what we think should be happening in developing these guidelines, and maybe we, as was just mentioned, that maybe we start by developing one ourselves. Well, somebody's got to start the ball, right?
Sure.
And we probably do have enough data to develop one between knowing, how much trash is generated. That's quite well known in here, specifically here. And then there's, all these formulas for how much space is needed to manage that amount of trash, within a building. And, I don't see why we couldn't start that process.
So David, what if we drew up a recommendation from the committee to the community board that whenever a developer comes before our committee, these are going to be some of the questions in the checklist we're going to ask, just like BLP does to ask certain things. That's informal. What do you think?
No, exactly. I think that's perfect. That's exactly what we
Hi,
should
this
do.
is Dolores. I had my hand raised and I'm sorry, no one had seen it. One of the things that I think is that, maybe we're not quite ready for a formal letter to Department of Sanitation, but what might be a good idea is to have a letter convening city planning just to float the idea. One, to find out whether or not there are things along the lines that they've been working on that this fits in well and get that feedback. And then also, when we had talked in the prep meeting of this presentation, talking to the Solid Waste Management Board, getting a little bit of feedback from them. I know, Shruti, you used some of their data as well in your presentation, but maybe after getting some feedback from city planning, that might be the appropriate time to formally present to DSNY or to get their feedback.
I'm not sure who's doing all this presenting and for. I think we need to find out what we can do from Shruti's report tonight. One thing we can do is write a letter saying we're going to.
Hey, JD.
Yes, Chris, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I also had my hand raised. No, I think that there's a lot of heavy lifting that's going on with this, but most importantly, what Dolores said is the exact mechanism by which that we have opportunities with the land use committee in city council, as well as the buildings committee in city council, and ways to start talking about this. These are opportunities to start leveraging our studies for legislation in city council, so that way we're not writing letters that are just something to consider, but that can become law. And so
how do we do that, Chris?
So I think we expand on the study that was presented to us today, and we suggest findings that we request to the legislative director of our city council member to ask for research to see what's possible in changing zoning laws as well as waste management laws to ensure that like we can capstone this and make it like we can codify it.
That's excellent thoughts. I'm just asking, what's the mechanism for doing all that work? Who does it?
Let's look at well, it would be the intern, and then it would be the chair, along with meetings with our council member, with our elected officials.
Okay, well, that sounds like something maybe to run by Jesse. That might be a working group that's going to take on a considerable amount of back and forth with various city agencies.
But we shouldn't do back and forth with the mayor because the mayor's checked out. This is an opportunity to do something with somebody who's checked in.
JD?
Yeah, sure. Joe, yes.
Yeah, so I think one of our problems is the study was conceived of at a different place and time. And I think it has real merit, but I think we are kidding ourselves if we're going to get any traction with the city council or the mayor's office at a point in time when the city budget is cratering. So I would say it's better if we internally determine how we can use it. We also don't have another intern and more staffing right now. How we can use it, and your suggestion about putting this onto our development checklist when we get things coming to us, I think is a most practical thing, because the folks in the city government are simply trying to keep the city government together with Band-Aids at this juncture. And new initiatives are simply not going to get funded. I mean, that's where we are as a city.
I agree with Joe.
So let's go back to drafting something tonight, or voting to draft something. David and I can put it together, if that's okay with David, about a checklist for the committee. For new developers that come in requesting, we can ask about all these things that Truby has brought up. I think that's a good first step, that we can get a letter to the board about that. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good first step, and you know, the meetings with city agencies may come, you know, bit by bit, or we might even, as we develop this checklist, we might even have a meeting with DSNY and say, you know, hey, what do you think? How does this work? Not, they don't have to spend any money on it.
Right.
At this point, it's just conversation. So, you know, we solicit input, we produce something. We've already produced something, Shruti has, and we produce a follow-up to that, what we're talking about, the checklist, and then we run that by various people at the city and get their input, and we run with it. And, you know, whether that ball gets taken up, you know, once the city is, you know, in some sort of formal process, gets taken up once the city's a little more together, you know, I think if we're successful, then it's likely to happen. You know, I do want to say that, you know, one of the people that were very, very encouraging about this project was the Speaker's office. You know, I presented it to them, and they were very encouraging. So, you know, that's already a good sign. Maybe by the time this is over, then he'll be mayor.
JD, question?
Yes, James.
Yeah, I'm curious, do the fellows cost the city anything?
It's the fund for the city of New York that pays for it.
Well, in addition to, I totally agree with what David said about maybe, you know, trying to set up a meeting with DSNY. Maybe, is that something where we could request another fellow to do follow-up research so we can find some more information? And I also agree with what David said about, you know, just gathering more information so that, you know, this is going to take probably 10 years, long after we're all off the board. So at least to get this ball rolling and doing the investigations, I think is a good first step. Not just trying to saddle developers with it, but also laying the groundwork for legislation that could happen in the future.
That's a good point. I think, Joe, are you still with us? I think there have been times on the board when a committee has started a process and it's gradually grown and become more important for the city. I think the Land Use Committee has done this. We start with, right? Joe, are you there?
If we adopt something and begin to implement it, a lot of times the things that the city doesn't like eventually become city actual procedure. So our board is always at the forefront of that. So the idea of incorporating this into our sort of check, like for example, on the question of LEED certification, the city never liked that. And now it's a standard thing that's in all city projects. We asked for that like 5 or 6 years prior. So I think if we do something internally and then adopt it as a board saying, here's one of our criteria for project review, that's a great first step. But I just think we're not going to get many people's attention given the hard, cold reality of the $6 billion budget shortfall at this moment.
And then, of course, there's also the possibility of spreading it around to other boards.
Yep, exactly.
Well, would somebody like to make a motion?
Well, hold on. JD, can I just put it into the chat box as well? But
Of course. Sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
I think maybe the idea of creating the checklist for land use committees to use with new development makes a great deal of sense. But I would want to make sure that the checklist doesn't get pushback from DOB or DSNY when we say to a developer, here, you have to put these dimensions for this amount of space, this much cubic footage, this much clearance into your new development so that waste can be collected in a different format. I don't want to have DSNY or DOB say, no, we're not going to agree to that. So I think if we can talk to them so that we can create a checklist that would pass by them, that would be helpful.
Okay, good point, Paul. Very good point. Would somebody like to make a motion about David Solnick writing this proposal? Go ahead.
Motion.
Go ahead, David.
I'll make that motion.
Okay,
You know,
what is your motion is what, sir?
To write a letter summarizing this and you know, the discussion we've just had about where we want it to go in the short term, and we are just talking about the short term, and about producing a development checklist with potentially with input from DSNY, maybe DOB, informal input from them, and you know, that would be it for now. But we can see how that carries on. And
I'll second it. That's what we did at BLP. We were the first community board to start doing the breakdown of what we wanted the restaurants and bars to do. and having them sign, and it caught on. Other bids started doing it, and now other boards started doing it. And now it's a standard practice. So.
And it's embodied in the state procedure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have
Who would this letter be going to?
It's not really a letter. It's an internal document, really.
Okay, because I think the motion was made to write a letter.
I mean, they may not get back, and they may get back. Who cares? I mean, you run to buy them.
I think the letter goes to the board. Tell the board that we've had this presentation.
I'll vote for that.
We're looking to incorporate in the Clinton Hell's Kitchen land use review some of these concerns and the checklist to ask the developers. So we have a motion, we have a second. I'm just going to ask, is anybody opposed, any committee member opposed to this motion? Since nobody is opposed, it carries. Shruti, again, thank you for this terrific job. And David, thank you for thinking of it and pushing us along. And this will have consequences, good consequences. Is there any new business that anybody would like to bring up at the moment? Janine, can you see if anybody's raising their hand?
No one has their hand up.
Okay. Is there any old business? Nobody? I guess not.
Motion to close.
We have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
We have a second. All in favor? Raise your hand.
Aye.
Janine, thank you so much.
All right, thank you all.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
committee. Thank you, David. Good job.
Everyone.
Okay, Paul.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.